Most people think you need a huge backyard to grow serious amounts of food. That's exactly why they never start gardening. They look at tiny balconies, patios, small yards, or apartment spaces and immediately assume growing vegetables isn't worth it. But here's the crazy part. Some vegetables actually produce better in containers than they do in traditional garden beds. I'm talking about crops that grow faster, stay healthier, avoid soil diseases, and keep producing harvest after harvest from nothing more than a bucket, pot, or grow bag. And today, I'm showing you 8 vegetables that turn tiny spaces into food factories. Some of these plants produce for months nonstop. One of them can feed an entire family from just a couple of containers. And another grows so aggressively in pots that beginner gardeners often think it's fake. The best part? Most of these vegetables are perfect for lazy gardening. Less weeding, less bending over, less pest problems, and way easier maintenance overall. So before we dive in, let me ask you something. If you could only grow one vegetable in a container for the rest of your life, what would it be? Tomatoes? Peppers? Potatoes? Drop your answer in the comments because I read every single one. And if you've ever thought you didn't have enough space to grow your own food, hit that like button because this video is about to completely change your mind. Alright, let's get into it. Plant number 1, cucumbers. Most people completely underestimate how productive cucumbers become in containers. They assume cucumbers need giant gardens sprawling across the ground. But honestly, containers might be one of the best ways to grow them. Here's why. When cucumbers grow directly in garden soil, they're constantly battling rot, pests, mildew, and diseases caused by wet leaves and poor airflow. But the moment you grow them vertically in containers, everything changes. Suddenly, the vines stay cleaner. The fruit stays straighter. Diseases drop dramatically. And harvesting becomes ridiculously easy. One healthy cucumber plant in a large container can produce dozens and dozens of cucumbers over a season if you give it sunlight and a simple trellis to climb. And once the plant starts producing, it feels nonstop. You pick cucumbers today, and somehow there are 5 more waiting tomorrow morning. That's why container gardeners love them so much. Massive production without needing huge amounts of space. And cucumbers actually like warm container soil. The roots heat up faster in pots during spring, which means quicker growth and earlier harvests compared to many traditional garden beds. I had a neighbor who grew 2 cucumber plants on a tiny apartment balcony using 5-gallon buckets and a cheap vertical trellis. By midsummer, the vines completely covered the railing and produced more cucumbers than her family could eat. She started giving them away to neighbors every week. Bonus tip: harvest cucumbers while they're still young and tender. The more frequently you pick them, the more aggressively the plant keeps producing new fruit. It's basically rewarding you for harvesting. Plant number 2, cherry tomatoes. This might be the king of container vegetables. Not giant slicing tomatoes. Not heirloom beefsteaks. Cherry tomatoes. And once you grow them in containers, you'll understand why so many gardeners become completely obsessed with them. Cherry tomatoes are unbelievably productive in pots because they naturally focus more energy on producing huge clusters of small fruit instead of a few oversized tomatoes. That means nonstop harvests for months. One healthy cherry tomato plant can produce hundreds of tomatoes in a single season. And unlike large tomatoes that constantly crack, rot, or struggle in containers, cherry tomatoes are way more forgiving and beginner-friendly. They thrive in grow bags, buckets, pots, raised containers. Honestly, almost anything with decent drainage. And because containers allow you to control watering more easily, many gardeners actually get better tomatoes in pots than they do in the ground. Fewer diseases, cleaner fruit, easier pruning. But here's the real secret. Cherry tomatoes are addictive because they turn gardening into instant gratification. You walk outside, grab a handful, eat them fresh right off the plant, and suddenly you understand why people become obsessed with growing food. That's why they're one of the best vegetables for beginners. They make gardening feel rewarding fast. Bonus tip: choose indeterminate cherry tomato varieties if possible. These continue growing and producing fruit nonstop until frost instead of stopping after one big harvest. Plant number 3, peppers. Peppers were practically made for containers. Seriously, once you grow peppers in pots, you may never plant them in the ground again. And here's why. Peppers absolutely love warm roots. In fact, One of the biggest reasons pepper plants struggle in traditional gardens is because the soil stays too cold for too long. But containers heat up faster in spring, which means peppers wake up earlier, grow faster, and start producing sooner. That extra warmth makes a massive difference. Suddenly your plants become bushier. Flower production increases. Fruit production explodes. And unlike sprawling vegetables that take over your garden, peppers stay compact and manageable, making them perfect for patios, balconies, and small growing spaces. But here's the crazy part. A single pepper plant can produce dozens and dozens of peppers over an entire season if you keep harvesting regularly. Sweet peppers, jalapenos, cayennes, banana peppers, most varieties absolutely thrive in containers. And because pots allow better airflow around the plant, you often deal with fewer fungal problems compared to crowded garden beds. I know someone who grew 6 pepper plants in simple black buckets on a sunny driveway. By late summer, the plants were so loaded with peppers the branches were literally bending under the weight. That's when you realize container gardening isn't some small harvest compromise. These plants can become ridiculously productive. Bonus tip: peppers love consistent feeding. Add a little compost or liquid fertilizer every couple of weeks once flowering starts, and production can skyrocket dramatically. Plant number 4, pole beans. If you want maximum food from a tiny amount of space, pole beans are almost unfair. Most people grow bush beans once, harvest once, and that's basically the end of the story. Pole beans are completely different. These things climb upward like crazy, turning fences, poles, balconies, and trellises into vertical food factories. And when grown in containers, they can produce nonstop for months. That's what makes them one of the best small space vegetables in existence. Instead of spreading outward and wasting precious garden space, pole beans grow up, which means even a tiny patio corner can suddenly produce huge harvests. And once the vines start climbing, the growth becomes insane. It almost feels like they double overnight. One week you've got tiny vines. The next week they're wrapping around everything in sight. Then suddenly, beans everywhere. The beautiful thing about pole beans is how low maintenance they are. They don't demand perfect soil. They don't need constant pampering. And because beans naturally help fix nitrogen in the soil, they're actually less needy than many heavy-feeding vegetables. This is one of those crops that makes beginner gardeners feel successful very quickly. You plant a few seeds, give them something to climb, water consistently, and suddenly you're harvesting bowl after bowl of beans from a single container. Bonus tip: pick pole beans young and frequently. If you let mature pods sit too long, the plant slows down production because it thinks its job is finished. Continuous harvesting keeps the plant in non-stop production mode. Plant number 5, lettuce. Most people think lettuce is boring, until they realize how insanely productive it becomes in containers. And honestly, this might be one of the smartest vegetables any beginner can grow. Why? Because lettuce gives you fast results. You don't wait months. You don't need huge containers. And you don't need perfect conditions. In fact, lettuce grows so quickly in pots that many gardeners harvest their first leaves just a few weeks after planting. That instant payoff is what hooks people into gardening. But here's where container growing changes everything. Containers let you move lettuce around depending on temperature and sunlight. When summer heat becomes intense, you can shift pots into partial shade to prevent bolting. That flexibility keeps your harvest going much longer than traditional garden beds. And because lettuce has shallow roots, it thrives even in relatively small containers. Window boxes, shallow planters, buckets, it doesn't care much as long as the soil stays moist. But the real secret lazy gardeners know? You don't harvest the whole plant. You harvest the outer leaves continuously while the center keeps growing. Which means one container can keep feeding you for weeks and weeks from the same plants. I knew a gardener who kept 6 lettuce containers rotating on a tiny apartment balcony year-round. She barely bought salad greens anymore because the containers constantly regenerated themselves faster than she could eat them. Bonus tip: plant new lettuce seeds every 2 weeks instead of all at once. This creates continuous harvest instead of one giant harvest followed by nothing. Plant number 6, potatoes. Most people think growing potatoes requires huge rows of farmland. That's completely wrong. In fact, potatoes may be one of the most satisfying vegetables you can grow in containers because of how ridiculously productive they become in small spaces. And honestly, harvesting them feels like digging for treasure. You start with a few seed potatoes buried in a bucket or grow bag. Then for weeks, it just looks like ordinary green leaves growing above the soil. Nothing exciting. But underground, an entire pile of potatoes is secretly forming. That's the magic of container potatoes. And unlike traditional garden beds where harvesting can damage tubers or leave potatoes behind, containers make everything easier. You literally dump the container out, and suddenly dozens of potatoes roll out everywhere. It's one of the most rewarding gardening experiences possible. Containers also solve one huge potato problem: drainage. Potatoes hate sitting in soggy soil, and pots allow excess water to escape much more easily, reducing rot and disease dramatically. Plus, grow bags and buckets warm up faster in spring, helping potatoes grow quicker during early planting season. And here's what surprises most beginners: potatoes produce an insane amount of food for the amount of space they use. One container can yield pounds and pounds of potatoes if grown properly. That's why survival gardeners and self-sufficiency growers love them so much. High calories, high production, minimal space. Bonus tip: keep adding soil or compost around the stems as the plants grow taller. This process, called hilling, encourages the plant to produce even more potatoes underground. Plant number 7, spinach. Spinach has a reputation for being difficult. But in containers, it becomes way easier to manage. The biggest problem with spinach is temperature. Once weather becomes too hot, spinach bolts almost instantly and turns bitter. That's why so many gardeners fail with it in traditional garden beds. Containers completely change the game. Because pots are movable, you can shift spinach into cooler shaded areas during warm afternoons, extending the growing season dramatically. That flexibility alone makes containers one of the smartest ways to grow spinach successfully. And spinach grows fast. Really fast. Within weeks, tiny seedlings transform into thick leafy greens ready for harvest. And just like lettuce, you don't need to remove the whole plant at once. You harvest the outer leaves while the center continues producing new growth. That means continuous harvests from the same container. Spinach also works beautifully for succession planting. While one container matures, another batch starts growing beside it, creating non-stop greens almost year-round in cooler climates. And because spinach roots stay relatively shallow, you don't need giant containers either. Even medium-sized pots can produce surprisingly heavy harvests. Honestly, once people realize how much spinach costs at grocery stores compared to how easy it is to grow, they never stop planting it. Bonus tip: use rich compost-heavy soil and keep spinach consistently moist. Dry soil causes stress and bitterness much faster, especially in warmer weather. Plant number 8, green onions. This might be the easiest container vegetable on the entire list. And once you start growing green onions, you realize how much money you've wasted buying them from grocery stores. Because these things just keep growing. Seriously, green onions are almost unbelievably productive in containers because they regrow incredibly fast after harvesting. Cut the tops, and new leaves appear again and again from the same plants. It almost feels endless. And unlike large vegetables that need deep containers and complicated setups, green onions thrive in small spaces. Tiny pots, window boxes, buckets, even recycled containers work perfectly fine. That's why so many beginner gardeners start with them. They're practically impossible to mess up. But here's the part most people don't realize: container-grown green onions often stay cleaner, straighter, and healthier than ones grown in crowded garden soil. Better drainage means healthier roots, and containers make watering much easier to control. Plus, they grow incredibly fast. You can start harvesting green tops surprisingly early, and the plants continue producing for months with very little maintenance. I know people who keep multiple onion containers outside their kitchen door year-round, so they always have fresh green onions ready for cooking whenever they need them. That's the beauty of container gardening. Convenience. Fresh food just steps away from your house. Bonus tip: instead of pulling the entire plant out, trim only the green tops and leave the roots intact. The onions regrow repeatedly, giving you multiple harvests from the same plants with almost no effort. And there you have it. 8 vegetables that can turn tiny containers into massive food-producing machines. You don't need acres of land. You don't need a giant backyard. And you definitely don't need perfect conditions to grow your own food. Sometimes all it takes is a few buckets, a sunny corner, and the right vegetables. That's the part most people never realize. Container gardening isn't some small version of gardening anymore. These plants can produce insane harvests in tiny spaces if you choose the right crops. And honestly, there's something incredibly satisfying about stepping outside and harvesting fresh food from a patio, balcony, or small backyard you thought could never grow anything. So here's your challenge. Pick one container vegetable from this list and grow it this season. Just one. Because once you see how productive container gardening can be, you'll never look at small spaces the same way again. And before you go, tell me in the comments. Seedling, which vegetable do you think produces the most in containers? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to Primal Gardening for more high-yield crops, container gardening, forgotten vegetables, companion planting, medicinal plants, and self-sufficient gardening content. Your small space might be more powerful than you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.